many centuries, the Islamic world was the major center of civilization. It was in every way the most advanced that the world had yet known. It was there that immense progress was made in virtually every field of creative endeavor, in the sciences, in the humanities, in government, in commerce. It also had a rather remarkable degree of freedom, vastly better than anything available in Christendom at that time. And people in the Muslim world, they are aware of what was and what is, and cannot but be horrified and enraged by the contrast.
I think that Islam today is in crisis, that it needs for deep questioning and deep reform, and that the only people who can bring about that change are Muslims.
The problem is not with Islam as a whole. The problem really is the Middle East and the Arab world in particular. This is not an inherently religious issue, which is therefore unanswerable, but a political and historical issue, which has very specific roots and causes and can have specific cures.
For the last 50 years, we basically treated the Arab world as a series of just big gas stations. And all we cared was that you keep the pump open, the price low, and be nice to the Jews. And you can do whatever you want out back. You can treat your women however you want, teach whatever you want in your schools, whatever you want. Well, guess what? On 9/11, we got hit with everything going on out back.
Funding for this program has been provided by the Smith Richardson Foundation and the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. Additional funding has been provided by and by has changed radically since September 11th, but the questions raised that day still challenge us. What could motivate young Muslim men to fly planes into buildings in America, to bomb subways in London, blow up train stations in Spain, murder school children in Russia? Is it religion that drives them, poverty, or something else?
I think it's important to bear in mind this is a society with a very strong sense of history, a very strong awareness of history. And Osama bin Laden in particular makes frequent historical allusions. He refers to Pharaoh, he refers to the Mongol invasions in the 13th century. And one is particularly interesting. He speaks more than once of what he calls the humiliation and shame which we, the Muslims, have suffered for more than 80 years.
وما تذوقه أمريكا اليوم هو شيء يسير مما ذقناه.
Just days after September 11th, bin Laden celebrated the attacks, twice referring to these 80 years of humiliation. This left many confused. What had happened more than 80 years ago? And what did it have to do with terrorism?
I have no doubt at all that his target audience in the Muslim world knew exactly what he was alluding to. He was alluding to 1918, the end of World War I.
In 1918, the Ottoman Empire, the last in a line of great Muslim empires stretching back 13 centuries, was defeated in the course of World War I.
They had chosen the wrong side, and they shared the defeat of their partners, Germany and Austria-Hungary. But to them it came in a much worse form. Their state was dismembered, their capital was occupied, their sultan was deposed, their major provinces in Asia were partitioned.
Unfortunately, even though most Arabs and Muslims disagree with the terrorist methods used by Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda his message resonates in Arab and Muslim imagination. Many Arabs and Muslims basically tend to believe that the modern Middle East is a Western invention. Its name, its frontiers, its dominant forms of political organizations are all Western attributes.
In the years after World War I, Great Britain and France largely dominated the Middle East. Many of its people found themselves citizens of new states with new Western-style governments, often with rulers chosen primarily for their loyalty to foreigners.
The Ottomans lost and the British won, and that meant that it was up to Britain what the Middle East was going to look like. On an empty map, they drew the lines and they created the states and they created the frontiers.
The colonial powers, for their own interest, carved the Middle East into countries, many of which did not take into account the facts of culture or history. You take, as an example, the Kurds, who have lived in one community for thousands of years. All of a sudden, after the First World War, they found themselves living in 5 separate countries.
Ethnic divisions and deep conflicts were embedded into these new nations, especially in places where antagonistic Sunni and Shiite Muslims were thrown together.
The difference between Shiites and Sunnis would have been relevant to what the British were doing if they had come into the Middle East in an effort to genuinely sponsor independence. But the British came with the intention of governing it. And that being so, these were not things that bothered the British. On the contrary, if anything, it was useful that the native populations were divided against one another. It's the old maxim of empire, divide and rule.
In the face of Western occupation, riots and revolutions were soon breaking out across the entire region.
They wanted to rule themselves really and truly. They made it very clear, unmistakably clear, they did not want to be ruled by European Christians.
One nation did free itself from European control, but ironically, this only further weakened the region's connection to its past. In 1919, a former Ottoman officer named Mustafa Kemal Pasha, or Ataturk as he later came to be known, launched a war of liberation and founded the modern state of Turkey. But Ataturk did not seek to revive the Islamic Empire of the Ottomans.
Ataturk is possibly the most successful modernizer in not just the Arab world, but in recent history. Here's a guy who takes the Ottoman Empire as it is ruined and carves out from it a great nation. And he does it by recognizing that in order to be a modern country, you have to turn your back on the past and you have to learn from the West. Ataturk shamelessly borrowed from the West.
In a series of sweeping reforms, Ataturk changed the written language of Turkey, replacing Arabic script with Roman letters, and imposed Western rules of dress and equality for women.
He said, our most urgent task today is to catch up with the modern world. We will not catch up with the modern world if we only modernize half the population. Simple, clear, and I think overwhelmingly convincing.
Ataturk also shocked many Muslims by separating religion and politics, displacing the Sharia, the holy law which governed almost every aspect of Muslim life, and abolishing the Caliphate, the official leadership position in Sunni Islam since the death of the Prophet Muhammad.
Imagine if Mussolini had eliminated the Vatican, forced Italians to write in the Arabic script instead of the Roman script, and forced them to dress in Arab clothing. How would the Catholics have felt?
He declared Turkey is a secular republic. There is no state religion. He went even further. He prohibited the teaching of religion in the schools. He prohibited the wearing of religious dress outside the places of worship. It was a very determined effort to secularize society to something which had never happened before in a Muslim country and still hasn't happened in more than a very few.
Repercussions of Ataturk's reforms are still felt, particularly his abolition of the Caliphate.
You cannot understand the rise of Islamist politics and Islamist groups without understanding their basic quest and longing to restore the caliphate, because they believe without the caliphate, Islam cannot be full in society.
For Islamic fundamentalists, Ataturk is a kind of Satan, a very dangerous figure, because he is someone who admired the West, copied it. But most of all, what galls the Islamic fundamentalists about Ataturk in Turkey is that it is successful. It is successful in combining an Islamic society with modernity, a Middle Eastern society with pro-Western foreign policy, all the things that they claim are impossible, Turkey has been able to do.
Turkey has proved to be a unique nation within the Middle East, as Ataturk's vision was rejected by most of the region. Faced with the challenges of modernity, many look to religion, not secularism. In the 1920s, the Arabian Peninsula was unified by a powerful family, the House of Saud, allied with clerics espousing a traditional version of Islam. And in Egypt, modern ideas were attacked by a large underground movement.
In the early 20th century, Egyptians began to expose themselves to Western intellectual thought, Marxism, feminism, evolutionary theory, even atheism were discussed publicly in the cafes of Cairo. But by the 1920s, thanks to anti-colonial rhetoric and pressures for Arabs to band together in solidarity against the West, these questions faded to a whisper. And at that time, what you saw was the emergence of Al-Qaeda's predecessor, the Muslim Brotherhood.
The Society of Muslim Brothers began as a small group of educated Egyptians who were deeply disturbed by the corruptions that colonial leaders were bringing to their land.
The line of the Muslim Brothers would run something like this. We were foolish enough to import infidel ways and infidel methods and infidel laws. We betrayed our own heritage. We abandoned the true faith that God gave us, and the result has been disastrous. The remedy, therefore, is to return to the past, not the real past, but a glorified imaginary past. And they were able to win considerable support for this sort of attitude.
The Muslim Brotherhood was the single most powerful political movement in Egypt. It was a kind of an umbrella organization that you can divide up into two groups. One group says that Westernization has gone too far. We have to re-Islamicize society, and we should do that by preaching and good works. Another group was more militant and said, no, it's 5 minutes to midnight. True Islam is going to be obliterated if we don't take drastic action. And that means taking control of the state by violence. So they assassinate British officials, assassinate Egyptians who are collaborating with the British, and so forth.
Over the ensuing decades, the Muslim Brotherhood would inspire splinter groups and radical imitators across the Islamic world, almost all bearing a similar anger against the new westernizing states, the liberation of women, and the abandonment of Sharia law.
Islam stepped in where secular intelligentsia failed. It provided the solutions. It became a very conservative force. They pulled the Arab world backward.
The argument of those people was that the West was threatening, reform was threatening the fundamental pillar of the family. Women going out and working with men together, women being educated, the unveiling of women, these were seen as danger.
To a large extent, the rise of Islamic fundamentalism could be read as a movement of angry men who are bewildered, disoriented in a new world, feel they are losing control over every aspect of their lives. And so the one area where they retain this control, they want to enhance it, and they want to keep women in a subordinate position.
By the 1930s, the established order in the Middle East faced a new threat, not from political rebellions or religious extremists, but from a rising force in Europe, Nazi Germany.
people in the Arab world allied themselves with the fascist powers, in large part because Britain and France were viewed as the colonial occupiers. And so the enemy of your enemy was your friend.
We know now from the German records that the chief mufti of Jerusalem offered his services within weeks of Hitler coming to power. And from 1938 onwards, Nazi Germany became the patron and protector of anti-Western causes.
The Nazis benefited from the animosity towards England and France, and from tensions in British Palestine, a largely Muslim region in which England had promised to foster a Jewish national home. And the Nazis tried to profit from this mood, launching massive programs that mixed political propaganda with military support.
Anti-Semitism is a fairly recent innovation in the Middle East. There were normal frictions before that, but it didn't become a major factor until the establishment of the Third Reich. Syria, Lebanon became a major base for Nazi activity. They managed to set up a pro-Nazi, pro-Axis regime in Iraq, the Ba'ath Party, which is a clone of the Nazi Party, and has no roots at all in the Islamic or Arab past. This is an importation from Europe.
World War II devastated its winners as well as its losers. When the fighting finally stopped, Britain and France lacked both the economic power and the political will to maintain their colonies. And so, soon after, many Middle Eastern states were given their independence.
What was established after World War I was ended after World War II. The British and the French empires, the mighty infidel powers that had defeated the Islamic armies, dominated Islamic states and countries, all broke up. What took their place? That is the question which has been agitating a lot of people since then.
Palestine, scene of fresh Arab outbreaks and defiance in the wake of the United Nations decision to create the first Jewish state in almost 2,000 years.
To most Arabs, the creation of Israel was very traumatic, very unsettling. Many Arabs see Israel as an extension of European colonialism and imperialism, as a colonial outpost planted in the heart of the Arab world in order to divide and weaken that part of the world.
In 1947, faced with the enormous devastation of the Nazi Holocaust and hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees, the United Nations voted to partition the British Mandate of Palestine into 3 new entities: an Arab state, an international zone in Jerusalem, and a separate Jewish state, Israel.
A couple of weeks later, the Arab League met in assembly and passed a resolution totally rejecting the UN resolution and declaring its intention to nullify it, if necessary, by force of arms.
In 1948, as Britain withdrew its troops, the Arab armies attacked.
The Jews in Palestine were not only outnumbered, they were also outgunned. But they had one great thing on their side. That is that they had nowhere else to go. 5 Arab states and armies marched in to prevent 500,000 Jews from establishing a state, and they failed. This sense of humiliation is a very, very important part of subsequent sentiment and hostility. It was the story that began in 1918 and reaching its nadir. All the heads of Arab governments who participated in the fiasco of 1948 were either deposed or assassinated.
In the wake of defeat, a generation of new leaders emerged, and there was a brief period of hope, an opportunity to build new nations in the Middle East, free of colonial interference. But these new leaders did not create open societies. Instead, they built repressive autocracies, bonded by animosity towards Israel.